In the dark corners of military history, where ambition outpaces logic and steel outgrows sense, two names echo like thunder: Gustav and Dora. Both were colossal railway guns designed by Nazi Germany to pulverize fortresses and terrify their enemies with sheer, overcompensating mass. The Schwerer Gustav is a known entity, photographed, fired, and documented. But Dora? Dora is different. Some say she was Gustav's sister, a second 80-centimeter artillery piece built in secret. Others say Dora was simply another name for the same gun. And then there are the conspiracy theorists. Dora was hidden, used in secret campaigns, or lost during Germany's collapse. So what's the truth? This is not just a story about a giant gun. It's a story about confusion, propaganda, lost records, and our own obsession with what if. Let's lay out the basics. Schwerer Gustav was a super heavy railway gun manufactured by Krupp in the late 1930s. It fired 7-ton shells at distances of up to 47 kilometers and needed 500 men and weeks of preparation just to get ready to shoot. Now imagine building two of these. The legend of Dora has survived thanks to blurry photographs, vague Allied intelligence, and conflicting German records. Some historians claim Dora was completed and deployed. Others insist she never fired a single shot. Some say she never even left the Krupp factory. But in the world of big guns, even bigger myths tend to grow. Over the next hour, we'll unpack the stories, the evidence, the contradictions, and the sheer logistics nightmare of building, moving, and firing these monsters. More importantly, we'll dig into why so many people still believe in a ghost gun. Did Dora exist? If so, where did she go? And if not, why are we still talking about her? Coming up, the origin story of Schwerer Gustav and how this steel leviathan shattered engineering limits and nearly Germany's own rail system. Before we can figure out whether Dora was real, we need to understand the giant that definitely was. Meet Schwerer Gustav. Commissioned in 1934 by Adolf Hitler himself, Gustav wasn't dreamt up by generals. It was the brainchild of Krupp, Germany's premier arm manufacturer. The goal? Build an artillery piece capable of cracking the French Maginot Line, those impenetrable concrete fortresses along Germany's western border. What emerged from Krupp's design shops was a behemoth, 80 centimeters in caliber, over 150 feet long, weighing 1,350 tons. This wasn't a gun, it was an immobile siege factory on rails. Its shells weighed up to 7 tons and could penetrate 7 meters of reinforced concrete or 30 meters of earth. Each shell had to be loaded with a crane, and firing just one round took 20 to 45 minutes. But Gustav's size came with baggage, literally. To move it, the Germans had to lay dual railway tracks across dozens of kilometers. The gun traveled in parts on specially modified trains and needed cranes, workshops, and hundreds of engineers just to be reassembled. The first and only confirmed combat use came in 1942 during the siege of Sevastopol in Crimea. Gustav fired 48 rounds and utterly demolished Soviet coastal defenses, bunkers, and ammunition depots. The destruction was real and photogenic. But here's the twist. Even with all that planning, Gustav was a nightmare to operate. It was slow, delicate, and required total air superiority just to function without being bombed to pieces. After Sevastopol, Gustav saw almost no further use. There were attempts to prep it for Leningrad and Warsaw, but logistics, changing battle conditions, and advancing Allied forces made redeployment nearly impossible. Still, Gustav had made its mark. It was photographed endlessly. It had a serial number. It had a known kill count. No one denies Gustav existed or was used. Which brings us to the question no one agrees on. If Gustav was all that, then what exactly was Dora? Because the story of Dora begins right here, in the shadow of her better documented brother. For every titan that thunders across the pages of history, there's always a shadow, less defined, less documented, but no less captivating. That's what Dora became. After Gustav's deployment and brief moment of fame in Sevastopol, The German high command still had faith in the idea of super heavy artillery. Whether it was practical didn't matter. What mattered was symbolism, fear, and Nazi obsession with spectacle. According to scattered German records, a second 80-centimeter gun was ordered and eventually constructed. This one would come to be known, somehow, somewhere, as Dora. But unlike Gustav, Dora's story immediately slips into ambiguity. Here's where the confusion begins. In the earliest factory paperwork from Krupp, only one serial number exists for an 80-centimeter gun. That gun is the one we know as Schwerer Gustav. But by the time field reports and soldier testimony emerge from the Eastern Front, references to a Dora start popping up. Some use the name interchangeably with Gustav. Others speak of it as a separate weapon entirely. Was Dora a nickname for Gustav used by the crews? That's entirely plausible. Military crews routinely name equipment, sometimes officially, sometimes informally. Gustav may have been Dora during its testing phase or among certain units. That alone could explain decades of confusion. But there's more. There are logistical records indicating that a second 80-centimeter gun was under construction in Essen during the early 1940s. Some sources suggest it was completed and even transported to a forward area, possibly in preparation for use at Stalingrad. But there's no photographic evidence, no firing logs, no confirmed deployment, not one shell credited to it. And yet, Allied intelligence documents recovered after the war mention Dora. They list 2 guns. They refer to them as distinct. The Allies believed there were 2, but belief isn't the same as proof. So what was Dora? Was it a sister gun that was finished too late to be useful? Was it a second prototype never deployed? Or was it always Gustav, rebranded in the fog of war, renamed by crews, and misfiled by history? That question will define every chapter going forward, because from here, we're no longer talking about engineering. We're talking about myth-making, misidentification, and the chaos of total war. And in that chaos, Dora would either be born or entirely imagined. If we assume for the moment that Dora existed as a separate entity from Gustav, the obvious question becomes, were they identical? In theory, both guns were built to the same specifications. An 80-centimeter caliber barrel, a weight of roughly 1,350 tons, maximum range of around 47 kilometers, these specs were dictated by the intended purpose: obliterate reinforced positions and smash through the deepest enemy fortifications. But documents hint at minor differences between the two. Some sources suggest that Dora had slight structural reinforcements based on lessons learned from Gustav's field deployment. The barrel cradle may have been modified. The mounting structure may have included additional stress supports. These are the kinds of changes engineers make once a prototype has proven its limitations. There's also a discrepancy in the shell loading systems. Gustav's was complex, crane-driven, and time-consuming. Later diagrams suggest Dora may have been intended to include a simplified or improved loading mechanism, possibly semi-automated, or at least more modular. Whether it was ever implemented remains unknown. Another area of uncertainty is mobility. Gustav required 2 parallel rail tracks and curved switching yards just to maneuver. It's possible that Dora was intended to use a revised mounting system that allowed for faster setup and teardown. Again, no clear evidence survives to confirm this. What's interesting is how these supposed differences became the seed for post-war speculation. Historians, armchair generals, and conspiracy theorists alike began to differentiate the 2 guns based on minor physical traits in grainy photos. One had a slightly different gun shield. One had different camouflage. One had an altered crane configuration. But these could easily be the result of field modifications or even maintenance work. At the end of the day, any distinctions between Gustav and Dora are speculative at best. If Dora was built separately, it was likely an evolution, not a revolution. A second version of the same gun with some technical refinements based on real-world experience. And yet, this lack of concrete detail is precisely what allowed the myth to grow. Because once the physical differences are gone, all we're left with are stories, and stories are far harder to disprove than specs. The guns may have looked the same, they may have even been functionally identical, But to many, Dora became something bigger, something secret, something improved, something that never quite had to prove itself because no one ever saw her fire. Among the most persistent and seductive claims about Dora is her alleged deployment to Stalingrad in late 1942. The story goes that Hitler, obsessed with crushing Soviet morale and turning the tide of the Eastern Front, ordered the massive gun to be sent east to pound the city into submission. It's a compelling tale, a secret superweapon brought in under the cover of night, setting up on rails outside the devastated ruins of Stalingrad. Shells the size of locomotives slamming into Soviet positions. The myth has been repeated in books, documentaries, and internet forums. But here's the problem. It doesn't hold up. For starters, there's no verifiable record that an 80-centimeter gun was ever deployed to Stalingrad. No German field logs, no Allied reconnaissance reports, and no Soviet records mention any such weapon in the vicinity. And this wasn't something you could hide. You didn't sneak a 1,350-ton gun into a combat zone unnoticed. The logistical demands alone make the claim suspect. Stalingrad's rail network was already stretched to the breaking point, supplying Army Group B. Adding a weapon that required custom dual tracks, dozens of flat cars, hundreds of engineers, and weeks of setup time would have been a disaster, especially with Soviet aircraft prowling overhead and Red Army forces pushing to encircle the city. Even if Dora had been transported that far, she would have needed weeks to prepare in favorable weather conditions. The fall of 1942 brought early snow, freezing temperatures, and deteriorating infrastructure. There's no evidence that the Germans ever had the time, resources, or air superiority required to make it happen. Some defenders of the Stalingrad theory point to vague witness accounts, soldiers who claim they heard incredible booms or saw massive shell craters. But there's a simpler explanation. The Germans used plenty of heavy artillery around Stalingrad, including 60-centimeter mortars like the Karl Gerät and massive air raids. The chaos of urban warfare makes it easy to misattribute destruction to the biggest gun in the rumor mill. There are also claims that Dora was en route to Stalingrad but never made it, either due to rail sabotage, strategic reprioritization, or mechanical failure. That's possible, but again unconfirmed. No rail manifests, no transit orders, no photographic proof. At best, it's plausible that Dora was intended for use at Stalingrad. At worst, it's just another layer of legend. One more way the gun's mystique grew without ever firing a shot. And once the 6th Army was encircled and the Soviets began closing the trap, any plans to deploy a megagun would have been dead in the snow. There was no time, no logistics, and no point. But the myth of Dora at Stalingrad persists, because in the ruins of a city where hundreds of thousands died, people want to believe that something titanic was at play, something that could have changed the course of the war, even if it never showed up. Assuming Dora was more than a myth, assuming she was constructed, assembled, and perhaps even deployed, what happened to her? The end of World War II left Germany in ruins. Its military archives were scattered, many intentionally destroyed. Equipment was abandoned, buried, or blown up. Some was taken by the Soviets, some by the Americans, and some simply vanished. For Schwerer Gustav, the ending is relatively clear. After its limited combat use, the massive gun was disassembled and moved to a rail yard in Germany. It was later destroyed by German troops to prevent capture. American forces eventually found the wreckage. Photos exist. The end of Gustav is recorded. But Dora? That's where the trail goes cold. Some sources claim Dora was dismantled in 1944 at the Krupp's work in Essen before it ever saw combat. Others suggest it was damaged during Allied bombing raids and quietly scrapped without ceremony. There are no confirmed photographs of Dora post-war. No Allied unit ever documented capturing or inspecting a second 80-centimeter gun. And yet bits and pieces of evidence suggest something might have been there. Allied technical teams reviewing German weapons post-surrender referred in some reports to 2 heavy railway guns of 80-centimeter caliber. Some post-war intelligence summaries list Dora separately from Gustav, implying the existence of a second unit. But these reports are inconsistent. Some may be duplicative. Others may be based on mistaken identity or confusion among captured German personnel. There's also the theory that Dora was transported to the Austrian Alps or southern Germany late in the war, hidden in tunnels alongside other advanced or symbolic weaponry. These theories often overlap with Nazi superweapon legends, underground fortresses, last-ditch Wunderwaffe projects, and ghost trains of treasure. The problem is, no hard evidence has ever surfaced. No remnants, no rail beds, no barrels, just paperwork fragments and oral histories. Another possibility is that Dora was partially built but never completed. In that case, her components may have been repurposed, melted down, or obliterated during Allied bombing. If that's true, then Dora never had a fate because she never fully lived. And then there's the simplest answer, that Dora was Gustav all along, that the name changed over time, passed along by engineers, soldiers, and writers until it evolved into a separate entity. In that case, Dora's fate would be identical to Gustav's, burned, blasted, and left as a shattered relic of Nazi overreach. Whatever the truth, Dora's fate is a blank page, and blank pages are easy to fill in with myth. Maybe that's exactly what happened. In the decades following World War II, the world became obsessed with Nazi superweapons. From documentaries to video games, movies to message boards, few topics have invited more breathless speculation. And among the parade of monsters, jets, rockets, and submarines, stands Dora. Whether or not she ever existed as a separate gun, Dora took on a life of her own in pop culture. The name itself is evocative, Dora. It doesn't sound like a siege weapon. It sounds like a code name, something secret and powerful. That branding made it easy to spin into legend. In video games, Dora is often portrayed as a massive cannon perched on railway tracks, ready to obliterate entire enemy divisions. She shows up in alternate history fiction, retro-futurist art, and speculative documentaries. Most of these sources don't distinguish between Gustav and Dora because they don't care. For the audience, it's all about the scale, the spectacle, the idea of an unstoppable gun. The conflation is understandable. After all, most people aren't digging through German logistics logs or 1942 railway timetables. They see the photos of a giant gun and the label says Dora. That's good enough. Even reputable documentaries have contributed to the confusion. Some reuse the same handful of images, incorrectly labeling them as either Dora or Gustav, depending on the narrative. Others suggest Dora fired at Leningrad, Stalingrad, or Warsaw with no evidence at all. The myth becomes self-perpetuating. On the internet, entire threads are dedicated to proving Dora existed, or disproving it. Some users insist they have seen different configurations. Others believe that Soviet intelligence confirmed 2 guns. Others claim eyewitness testimony. The arguments loop endlessly, citing the same scraps of conflicting data. And yet all of this noise reinforces one thing. People want Dora to be real. There's something about the scale, the mystery, and the ambiguity that captures the imagination. Dora became the Schrodinger's gun of World War II, both real and not, firing and unfired, steel and shadow. The longer the story persisted without closure, the more attractive it became. She's a perfect myth, just plausible enough to believe, just mysterious enough to doubt. And like all good myths, Dora stopped being about what she was. She became about what we want her to be. To understand the truth behind Dora, it helps to ask a deceptively simple question. Where did the name come from? The answer isn't as mysterious as it might seem. During the testing phase of the 80-centimeter railway gun, the weapon was given the nickname Dora by the Krupp engineers and railway crew. It was common practice to assign personal names to major equipment, especially prototypes. In this case, Dora was likely named after the wife of one of the project's senior engineers. This name stuck during trials and initial transport, well before the gun saw combat. By the time it was deployed in Sevastopol in 1942, the gun had been renamed officially as Schwerer Gustav, or Heavy Gustav, in honor of Gustav Krupp, the head of the Krupp company. But that early nickname didn't disappear. Soldiers and engineers who had worked on the gun during its assembly and transport continued to refer to it as Dora. The name circulated through the ranks, and soon, Both names were in use depending upon who you talked to and when. The dual identity is likely the origin of the myth. When Allied intelligence began sifting through German records and testimonies, they encountered references to both Gustav and Dora, often without clarification that they were the same gun. Some German prisoners spoke about Dora, others spoke about Gustav. Some used the names interchangeably, others treated them as distinct. Combine that with incomplete wartime documentation, destroyed factories, and thousands of personnel rotating in and out of units, and confusion was inevitable. Compounding the issue, wartime censors and propagandists occasionally altered or omitted technical details in reports, sometimes replacing specific identifiers with more generic names. In post-war retellings, the two names evolved into two different weapons. This was the most plausible explanation. Dora was the informal nickname for the only operational 80-centimeter gun, the one that would officially become Schwerer Gustav. There was no second gun that fired, no mystery weapon hiding in the east, just one colossal machine with two names. But even that conclusion doesn't settle everything. There may still have been a second gun under construction. It may have been completed. It may have sat unused. It may have been mistaken for Gustav by both German crews and Allied observers, or it may have been scrapped without ceremony. What's clear is that Dora, as she lives in the public imagination, owes her fame less to firepower and more to folklore. She's a product of the gaps in the record, of names whispered across battlefields and misfiled in archives. And in those gaps, she took root, not as a weapon, but as a legend. With so much uncertainty, it would be easy to dismiss Dora as a historical footnote, a clerical error, a nickname that got out of hand. But the truth is, Dora has become something far more persistent, a myth that refuses to die. In a world where so many wartime stories are neat, categorized, and confirmed, Dora is a rare case of ambiguity. She sits in the space between fact and fiction, between paperwork and legend. That space gives her power. Historians have spent decades trying to sort it out. The most rigorous conclude that only one 80-centimeter gun ever saw combat. That gun was Schwerer Gustav. It was nicknamed Dora early in its life, and that nickname stuck. The second gun, if completed, never fired. It may never have left the factory. And yet the belief in Dora's separate existence endures. That's not just a failure of documentation. It's a reflection of something deeper. We like big weapons. We're fascinated by scale. When we hear about the largest gun ever built, our minds want to double it. If one was impressive, two must be incredible. We also like secrets, lost weapons, hidden technologies. The idea that something massive and world-changing could have existed and then vanished plays into our hunger for mystery. Dora fits perfectly into that framework. And so, despite the best efforts of researchers, the myth regenerates. A mislabeled photo, a mistranslated memo, a dramatized documentary. The cycle restarts. Dora remains real in the minds of those who want her to be. But in the most remarkable part isn't that the people believe in Dora, it's that even when presented with the facts, many still prefer the legend. The ambiguity is more interesting than the reality. Maybe that's what Dora truly is. Not a second gun, but a lesson about how history is shaped, not just by what happened, but by what we chose to remember. About how easily names become narratives, and how those narratives, once seeded, can grow into giants, just like Dora. In the end, the story of Dora isn't really about a gun. It's about how we construct history, how names mutate, how myths take shape, and how even the most technical, documented machines of the war can become distorted by time, repetition, and fascination. There was a gun called Schwerer Gustav. It was real. It fired. It was massive. It was inefficient. It was the physical embodiment of Nazi overconfidence. Too big to move, too slow to adapt, and too vulnerable to survive in the modern battlefield. There may have been a second gun, partially built or completed too late to matter. That gun may have been called Dora. Or perhaps Dora was just an early nickname for Gustav that got carried through the war and picked up by enough people to stick. What matters is what Dora became. She became the possibility of more, of hidden weapons and lost potential, of alternate outcomes. She became a story people could tell when the facts weren't enough, and because of that, she outgrew her steel and rivets. She became legend. That's why you'll find her in documentaries, games, articles, and arguments. Not because she fired a single shell, but because she became a symbol of power, of mystery, of absurd extremes of warfare. The world only needed one Schwerer Gustav, but history gave us two names. And from those two names, it gave us a puzzle. Whether you believe Dora was real or not, her legacy endures, not on a battlefield, but in the shadows between certainty and speculation. And maybe that's where the most powerful weapons of all are born. I appreciate you watching. Please consider subscribing. Until next time, stand tall.